Let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony. Ms. Clark, you may begin.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Roy, Ranking Member Scanlon, Ranking Member Nadler, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Protecting civil rights is essential to the Department of Justice. In fact, the department was created in 1870 in part to confront the Ku Klux Klan and others who used terror and violence to prevent Black people from exercising their civil and constitutional rights. Nearly 100 years later, Congress gave new energy to this work by enacting legislation that established the Civil Rights Division and empowered it to protect the civil rights of every person in America. Our work remains vital as we continue, sadly, to see acts of bigotry, violence, and discrimination in many aspects of life. The division combats these harms by enforcing the Constitution and the protections enshrined in law by Congress. We work to ensure that every eligible American has voice in our democracy by confronting voting discrimination. And we work to advance equal opportunity in employment, housing, education, and more. We safeguard the rights of people with disabilities, and we defend the civil rights of those who defend our nation in the armed forces, both past and present. We work to vindicate the rights of sexual assault survivors and people who experience sexual harassment on campuses, in workplaces, in housing, and in jails and prisons. We work to ensure that law enforcement personnel carry out their jobs lawfully and without bias. This work includes prosecutions of officers who abuse their power, including officers tied to the tragic deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, and Tyree Nichols in Memphis. Work that has particular urgency today is our response to bias-motivated violence. FBI data show that reported hate crimes are at the highest level in more than a decade. Black people remain the group most frequently targeted by hate crimes, and crimes motivated by anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and bias against the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity have also climbed in number. In the weeks following the devastating October 7th attacks in Israel and ensuing violence in the Middle East, we've seen an alarming rise in acts of hate in our neighborhoods, on our campuses, and in our streets. We know that too many communities are living in fear, and we've all seen the horrors that result from hate. The Charleston 9, the El Paso 23, the Tree of Life 11, the Buffalo 10, the Club Q 5, the Jacksonville 3. Each of these tragedies offers a bleak testament to the death, pain, and trauma that can flow from bigotry and hatred. And so the division's top priority is to investigate and prosecute unlawful acts of hate. Since January of 2021, the division has charged more than 105 defendants in more than 95 cases for committing hate crimes, and during that same period, we obtained more than 90 convictions. For example, the division secured a guilty verdict against the man who killed 11 people and critically wounded 7 others at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The division also secured a conviction of the man who killed 23 and wounded 22 more at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, victims targeted because of their Hispanic identity. And we secured convictions of the 3 men responsible for the racially motivated killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. Hate crimes are message crimes. The perpetrators not only target their direct victims, but also seek to instill fear in the victim's community. But our prosecutions send a louder and more powerful message that hate crimes will not be tolerated in our democracy, that perpetrators will be punished and held accountable, and that the communities targeted will be safeguarded by the federal government. As I close, I want to recognize the hundreds of dedicated public servants in the Civil Rights Division who carry out this critical work. Their commitment inspires me each day, and I'm honored to represent them here today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Clark, in a June 2020 op-ed, you wrote, quote, "I advocate for defunding policing operations that have made African Americans more vulnerable to police violence and contributed to mass incarceration while investing more in programs and police policies that address critical community needs." Since that time, in summer of 2020, there have been significant drops in recruiting police nationwide, significant evidence of morale dropping for our police officers and communities across the country. Simple statement, do you stand behind that statement in the op-ed that you wrote in the summer of 2020, advocating, quote, for defunding policing operations? Microphone, ma'am.
The Justice Department fully supports funding and supporting our law enforcement
Well, but my
officers.
question was different than that. I mean, you penned it, and you are the head of the Civil Rights Division, and you penned the op-ed in the summer of 2020, in the midst of significant unrest around the country, where our law enforcement community was dealing with significant attacks on them. And you wrote, "I advocate for defunding policing operations." Do you stand by that statement?
I've not advocated for defunding law enforcement. At the Justice Department, we allocate millions of dollars by way of our Office of Justice Programs, COPS Office, Office of Violence Against Women, to
Ma'am,
support
I
law
want to
enforcement.
give you the time to answer on the question. The question is just simple. You wrote that statement. Do you stand behind that statement, or do you now repudiate that statement?
I have not advocated for defunding law enforcement, Chairman, and I appreciate the difficult jobs that our law enforcement officers do each day to keep us safe, and believe it's important that they have the resources to carry out their jobs.
Well, importantly, Black Americans make up 36% of violent crime victims, but only 14% of the population. Do you think defunding the police, as you wrote in an op-ed in June of 2020, it's in writing, do you think defunding the police makes African Americans, Black community, more vulnerable to violence?
I support ensuring that law enforcement have the resources and support needed to carry out their jobs. Public safety is a top priority for all of us.
I would note that the City of Austin and the Travis County DA's office sent you a joint letter just, I think, yesterday or maybe the day before, announcing that 17 of the 21 Austin Police Department officers indicted for alleged excessive force violations between May 29 and May 31 in that summer of unrest were cleared. We had 17 law enforcement officers who were indicted by the local DA, and then they were suddenly cleared. But then they sent a letter the same day requesting that the DOJ Civil Rights Division investigate the Austin Police Department, despite the fact the Austin Police Department had been a model for the Department of Justice how to engage in the use of force. My question for you is, will you investigate the district attorney for having indicted 17 police officers and then suddenly walking away for a political safe phasing rather than investigating the police department?
I'm not aware of that correspondence. I'm happy to look into this matter further, Chairman.
Well, I would look forward to working with your office to do that. It's extraordinarily concerning. In your written testimony, you mentioned that DOJ has prosecuted FACE Act violations involving both abortion providers and pregnancy resource centers. Can you tell us how many FACE Act cases have been filed since it was enacted in 1994?
So the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act is an important law. We apply it even-handedly. I don't have statistics on the number of cases since the law's passage.
Would it surprise you that the data I have says that it's been brought 130 times since 1994? Because then my question is how many FACE Act cases have been filed in defense of abortion providers or in defense of pro-abortion activists versus how many FACE Act cases have been filed in defense of pro-life Americans or churches that have been attacked And I wonder if you know the date on those.
Well, I believe in outreach and have been aggressively conducting outreach to all groups so that the public understands that the FACE Act applies to both pro-choice and pro-life groups. And I will flag for you, Chairman, that we recently had January indictments against 2 Florida residents for spray painting threats on pregnancy resource centers.
And I certainly appreciate that you all did that, but the numbers I have are out of 130 uses of the FACE Act since 1994, 126 were for pro-abortion activists and in defense of abortion providers, and 4 have been for pro-life Americans and or churches. And I think that was one of them in January. I'd let you respond to that, and then I'm out of my time.
Well, while I can't speak to what happened in prior administrations, what I can assure you is that the division is committed to full and even-handed enforcement of this important federal law.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you for coming before this committee, and thank you for your work and dedication to seeing that the Constitution